workers and eventually forcibly remove workers who have been standing at that picket line for the last year. And, that was an absolutely cowardly abuse of state power and resources. And I'm sure you'll all join me in extending solidarity to Jane Crowe, and who's here speaking today. She's the shop steward at Henry Street. And to all the Debenhams workers who have stood through rain, hail, snow, and intimidation to demand decency and respect from an employer many of them have given 20 plus years to. Despite the political leaders in the South sometimes harking back to the radical traditions of the Labour, republicanism and socialism and radical politics, the truth is that their inaction and their cowardice around the Debenhams strike has shown that they're a million miles away from the likes of Connolly, Larkin and other Labour organisers. In the North, we constantly hear the narrative that there exist two communities or two traditions, unionism or nationalism, but rarely do we hear of the commonality that exists between working class communities of all shades and stripes. Rarely do we see the continual focus on labour and workers' struggle for past and the workers' struggle past and present that points to the common interest that workers have across the North and also between the North and the South. It's much easier to focus on the repeated and predictable debates framed through the prism of unionism and nationalism. There's a strong tradition of worker solidarity across the island, and we have trade unions that exist across the island, and we have many examples of solidarity that don't recognise the border, which I'm sure our panelists will discuss now. So just to introduce our speakers quickly, and I'll only give them a quick line and they can introduce themselves further if they want to. First up, we're going to have Dave Gibney, who's a prominent trade unionist based in Dublin, and he's also a podcaster with The Week at Work. Following that, we'll have Tommy McKearney, who's a socialist Republican. He organises with the Independent Workers Union, and he's also the author of the Provisional IRA from Insurrection to Parliament. The third speaker, I don't think will need an introduction, but Jane Crowe. She is the shop steward at Henry Street, and she's been on the picket lines for the last year, defending the stock and fighting for a fair redundancy, not just for the Debenhams workers, but for all workers in Ireland. And finally, we'll have Niall McCarroll, who's the chairperson of the Dairy Trade Union. So without further ado, I will send back to Dave Gibney, if that's okay with yourself, Dave. Just unmute yourself, and whenever you're ready, please take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivan. Without wanting to sound funny, I'm delighted to see that you're not still in custody. Fair play to you the other night. People should know that I was one of the people that was arrested for sitting on the road outside of the Debenhams picket. So it doesn't. I just don't want people to think you weren't there either. Just look, thanks again for the invitation to this important event. I think it's important that we have these discussions, particularly about the labour movement, and sometimes it gets left behind. But I think it's important, particularly important on this day. So most of you are probably aware this day from 105 years ago, the Republic was proclaimed. And while everybody knows the words of the 1916 proclamation, very few probably know the words of the Democratic Programme for the First Dáil in 1919, which was written by Tom Johnson, who was a trade union member of a precursor union to Mandate Trade Union, who I work for. But fewer still know the deleted paragraphs. And I wanted to kick off this discussion with those paragraphs. In the Democratic Programme, the original, it stated, "It shall be the purpose of the government to encourage the organisation of people into trade unions and cooperative societies with a view to the control and administration of the industries by the workers engaged in those industries. Finally, the Republic will aim at the elimination of the class in society which lives upon the wealth produced by the workers of the nation, but gives no useful service in return, and in the process of accomplishment will bring freedom to all those who've hitherto been caught in the toils of economic servitude." Now, some of you might be aware that those paragraphs were deleted by a certain Michael Collins. But when we look at how our two states, North and South, treat trade unionists and trade union activists, it's very clear to see that we were never going to live up to those ideals. There was no appetite from the people who took control to live up to those ideals. As you've just mentioned, Sive, we just need to look at the Debenhams workers and how they were treated the other night, which was absolutely abysmal, appalling. Maybe Jane will get into what happened later on, but just to say, I've never seen a turnout by Gardaí to anything that we saw the other night, especially the public order unit. But also I wanted to say about how restrictive our rights are. Down south, we have no right to representation for collective bargaining purposes whatsoever. We have among the highest prevalence of low pay in the OECD, behind only the USA and South Korea, with only the UK challenging us as well. That's the north of Ireland, which has a high...
Sorry, Dave, I'll just ask anyone coming in just to mute themselves. Sorry, Dave.
Yeah, no problem. Will I continue, yeah?
Yes, please. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. But one other statistic that sometimes gets forgotten on the low pay issue is that in the South, we have 112,000 people underemployed. That's 5.3 of our entire workforce. And up north, it's worse with 48,000 underemployed, or 6.8%, with Derry and Strabane at 9%, which is almost the worst in the entire developed world in terms of underemployment. And the reason I think these statistics are some of the statistics that we need to pay more attention to is that underemployment means that when you want to work more hours, but you can't access them. And the reason you want to work more hours is probably because you're living in poverty or you can't pay the bills, but your boss controls your hours. And we saw that a number of years ago with the Dun Stores campaign, where in 2014 and 15, when Mandate Trade Unions set up that campaign, workers in Dun Stores were all on 15-hour contracts. If they joined a union, if they were vocal, if they made a grievance about a health and safety concern, like a fire exit being blocked, they could have their hours cut from 40, which they might have been working for 10 years at, 40 hours per week, to 15. And that by extension means that they can't pay their bills anymore. So it's an extreme level of control that employers have over workers, or had over workers, I should say. But worse still, they could actually cut those hours to 15 and spread those 15 over 4 days, which meant you couldn't access supplementary social welfare, family income supplement, or part-time dole. So they had the ability not only to restrict your earnings at work, but also how much the state could pay you. And a caring state, and a state that gave a shit about trade unions, obviously wouldn't allow something like that to happen. But that's why those workers in Dun Stores mobilized. They went on strike and proved their own point. When they went on strike, retribution the very next day was people had their hours cut all over the country, and there was 6,000 workers on that strike. So you can imagine the level of retribution that happened. But for 4 years, those workers campaigned to change the legislation, to not just for themselves as well, but to change it for everyone, to give everybody certainty of earnings. And they won in 2018 with the Employment Miscellaneous Provisions Act, which, if people don't know about it, it is a real game changer when it comes to low paid work and insecure work. So now workers, after 12 months service, are entitled to seek a contract that reflects the hours that they work. So they're guaranteed those hours. Many people don't know about it, so we should really be singing from the hilltops about this piece of legislation. Unfortunately, that legislation doesn't apply up north, but it's something that definitely trade unions in the north should be looking at. But all of these issues around low pay and insecure work, and the inability to collectively bargain, they all spill over into the rest of our lives. As I mentioned there about housing, if an employer can control whether or not you can pay your mortgage or your rent, they can make you homeless. They spill over to healthcare, education, and climate justice, everything. So we need legislation that enables workers to get organized themselves. And I'll come to the 1990 Industrial Relations Act in a minute, but obviously that we want to scrap that. Our union, my union, who I'm not speaking for today, by the way, just to emphasize that, but a raft of unions across the movement have motions and agreed motions to scrap the 1990 Industrial Relations Act. But what I would say is, what are we going to replace it with? And I'd argue that it should be a Fair Work Act. And what I would put into a Fair Work Act, really, I'll go through the stuff that I would like to see in a second. But in a united Ireland, the opportunity there is that we're starting from scratch. So we need to have these debates and talk about what we'd like to see in a Fair Work Act. And there's three things that a Fair Work Act should do. It should, first of all, make it easier for workers to join a trade union. It should make it easier for workers to collectively bargain. And thirdly, it should make it easier for workers to take industrial action, all of which are restricted at the moment. That can mean something as small as trade union deductions at source. We are in dispute with a number of companies, one of which has decided, a multinational, that if a worker goes on strike in a store, if a store goes on strike, that they will stop deductions at source and passing them on to the trade union, thereby stopping those workers from being a member of that trade union unless they go and re-recruit all the time. So all we need is a statutory instrument on this one, I believe, to make sure that if a worker wants to be a member of a trade union, they sign a form, send it off to their employer, and deductions at source are guaranteed. They can do it for pensions. If a worker wants to be in a pension fund, which is pro-capitalist, they have facilitated that. But why haven't they done it when it comes to the pro-work or pro-labor side of things? Then there's right to access, and this one I have specific personal sort of experience with, which is that when I was an organizer in Australia, with 24 hours notice, I could fax any company anywhere in Australia and turn up the next day for 3 reasons. 1, to do workplace rights compliance inspections. 2, to do a health and safety inspections, and 3, for collective bargaining purposes. And the employer had to provide me with a room to have those discussions with workers. That legislation applies in New Zealand and several other countries as well. We need that in Ireland because we can't get in to talk to workers. And that's the most important thing. It's even beyond the collective bargaining stuff. If we can just talk to workers first and foremost, it makes it a lot easier. Then in terms of making it easier to collectively bargain, as you know, the South has no collective bargaining rights whatsoever. We need to talk about that and what type of collective bargaining rights we want, how we trigger it. And I know People Before Profit have a piece of legislation coming up in a couple of weeks that will make it easier. With a threshold of 20% of workers get organised, then they can trigger collective bargaining negotiations. And I haven't gone through the legislation in detail, but I will. And what I want to say is that this is essential, that all political parties, all trade unions start rallying behind these pieces of legislation and chip away at the system that's preventing workers from having a collective voice. I'd also say collective bargaining compensation to prevent freeloaders. And this is something that was discussed in Australia when I was there, and there was legislation put forward where a union wins a significant pay increase for workers, and there's a load of people in there who are not members of that trade union. They should be expected to contribute something towards the enterprise bargaining unit that has just won them a pay increase. And then state supports. The state should not provide any funding, support, grants, or contracts to any employer that refuses to collectively bargain with a trade union. And then this is a key one that we all know about right now, which is make it easier to take industrial action. We have some of the most restrictive laws in the world. One thing that always strikes me and brings me back to comparisons was the Ryanair strike, because we saw it happening all across Europe at the same time. So I was watching very closely about the differences between the legislation that applies in different countries. And in Germany, I thought it was really fascinating that the Ryanair pilots issued 24 hours notice before they went on strike. And they gave the 24 hours notice as a courtesy to the customers. They actually have no legal restrictions around how much time they give to an employer to go on strike. And in Ireland, the Ryanair pilots, like all other workers, have to give 7 days in notice before they go on strike, which provides the employer with 7 days of victimization, intimidation, and threats to workers about losing their jobs, about cuts to hours, and all sorts of things. So we need, again, that piece of the 1990 Act, but we need the whole Act gone. But secondary picketing and all the rest. But one of the big things that people don't know about as well in Ireland is that we used to have a really progressive piece of legislation that enabled strikes, which was the 1906 Act. And the 1906 Act basically enabled workers to strike wherever they wanted. And there was a really interesting case that I found in our archives from Kilkenny, where it was in 1969, where workers went on strike across the street from their own employer at a competing firm, because that competing firm was undermining their terms and conditions. So when you have people celebrate when they hear Aldi and Lidl are setting up a store in their local community, they don't think about the low pay that's provided by those employers taking jobs away from decent jobs from the retail sector across the road, right? Because there's only a limited amount of sausages and rashers that you can buy. So we need to have that conversation about if one set of workers is undermining they were called worker versus worker disputes back then. But if one set of workers is undermining the terms and conditions of a group of workers in the vicinity, then they should be allowed to go on strike there as well. So I'm going to move on to how do we get there, because I have a lot more of things that I would have put into a Fair Work Act, but I don't have really the time to go through it here. But how we get there is very simple: struggle. There are many people in Ireland and in the trade union movement and in political parties that don't think we need to struggle anymore because we have universal suffrage, and that if we appeal to the good nature of politicians and the government and employers, that they'll just afford us what we want. But they even forget where universal suffrage came from, and it was struggle. But even going back 100 years to the living in system, to the right fight for the people for people to have the right to join a trade union. And even you know, in 1945, when the Irish Women Workers Union went on strike for 3 months to win 2 weeks annual leave, to the Dunstores anti-apartheid strike, which took 2 years and 9 months to ban South African goods. All of the things that we have today were provided through struggle, class struggle. But you know, even today, right now, even in recent years, you think about the repeal struggle, the marriage equality struggle, and even the Right to Water campaign. They're all illustrative of the need to struggle for the type of Ireland that we want to live in. A united Ireland, in my opinion, is inevitable. But even Tories like George Osborne agree. It's just a matter of timing and what type of united Ireland we get. And that's why I'm involved, and I know another number of people on this are involved with the Trade Unions for a New and United Ireland group. So look them up on Facebook and Twitter. But I wanted to end with 2 quotes. First one is from Frederick Douglass, just about struggle as well. And he said, "Those who profess to favour freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without ploughing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, and it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will." And then the only other quote I'd add to that is James Connolly, and it would be remiss if I hadn't mentioned him in my talk. So I wanted to cite a little piece from Labour, Nationality and Religion, where he talks about Father Keynes saying the will of the people would be nothing more than the whim of a tyrant mob. And Connolly is addressing that by saying, he explains how it was the mob, the so-called mob, who advanced humanity to the point where we are today, or at that time. In this civilizing, humanizing work, the mob had at all times to meet and master the hatred and opposition of kings and nobles. And there is not in history a record of any movement for abolishing torture, preventing war, establishing popular suffrage, or shortening the hours of labor led by hierarchy. He goes on and says, "All hail then to the mob, the incarnation of progress." And that goes again back to the struggle that I'm talking about. We have to get our feet dirty. We have to get our hands dirty. We have to get out on the streets and fight for the things that we want. We have to analyze where the weak points are in capitalism and in capital. And we have to fight and do the dirty work. And that's why I wanted to end with, to paraphrase Connolly and say, "All hail to the Debenhams workers," because their fight, as you said at the start, is not just their fight. Their fight is so that nobody else has to go through what they've gone through. And we've seen it with Cleary's, with La Senza, with the Paris Bakery. It happens over and over again. And the reluctance of the state to actually legislate is very clear to me why. Because if they legislate and prevent stuff like this from happening again, and make sure that workers who have collectively agreed redundancies get those redundancies, it's an advertisement to join the trade union movement, because you're better off in a trade union movement. You don't just get the statutory entitlement, you'll get an enhanced redundancy if you do so. So that shows the level of hatred that the state has towards trade unionists and trade union activists. So I'll finish up on that with all hail to the Debenhams workers.
I think that's a very good point to finish on. All hail to the Debenhams workers. Thank you so much, Dave. That was a really fantastic talk. I'm going to move quickly on, because I know we started a bit late there, to Tommy McKearney. And I will just say actually quickly that unfortunately Niall wasn't able to make it with us, but I'm sure we have a great lineup still. So Tommy McKearney, if you'd like to say a few words, I'll just ask you to, if you just want to unmute yourself, and I just ask you to keep it to about 10-15 minutes, if that's okay. Thank you so much.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thanks so much, Tommy.
Okay, thank you, Saif, and thanks for this invitation. I hope to address a little bit more general than Dave, which Dave's presentation was excellent, and I think his concluding remarks, "All hail to Debenham workers," was a splendid piece of thinking for a very heroic group of workers. I think what we have to look at here when we're talking about an alternative Ireland, when the title of this discussion, "Labour is the cause of Ireland," and Connolly's phrase, "Ireland is the cause of labour," I think we have to define what we're talking about here when we're talking about the cause of Ireland, what we mean about this. And what we're not talking about, I think it's important to say what we're not talking about, and that's seeing labour as some sort of a prop for United Ireland, that would be effectively a 32 county version of the 26 counties. I think we're talking about something qualitative. That's not what we're talking about, that we would be, if you like, inveigling trade unions into supporting a call for a nationalist Ireland, albeit maybe with some vague promise to increase the minimum wage by €1 or something like that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something qualitatively different. We're talking about an Ireland which has independence and sovereignty. And independence and sovereignty are crucial for the benefit, for the progress of working people. And at the end of the day, only working people, only the working class has its self-interest, has a class interest in delivering an independent, sovereign Ireland. And we may have some fallen into this idea that independence was achieved for the 26 counties way back in 1922. And I think that's a false reading of the situation. Independence means, and sovereignty, that we have the right and the capability and the ability to take decisions for ourselves. Look, in even the simplest of facts, Ireland, for the Republic of Ireland, or what's the 26 county state, for 50 years after the treaty, it had a currency tied to British sterling. It didn't have its own currency. For 20 years, it had its own currency, but then by 1999, it again handed over its ability to have its own currency, gave it to the European Union. This in itself is a concession, a compromise. It's a betrayal of independence and sovereignty. And independence, we're talking about the independence that allows us to take the type of decisions that would counteract the dictates of capital. That's what we have to talk about. That's what we need to think about. This is what we mean here by Ireland being the cause of Labour and Labour being the cause of Ireland. At the moment, we're faced in the Republic of Ireland with a housing crisis. There's probably over 100,000 people on the housing list, 1,000 homeless. That won't change until we challenge the concept of a free market in housing, the concept of social or affordable housing even, which is a bogus understanding of what's needed. We need public housing, but that can only be delivered with a state that is committed to doing so, an independent and sovereign state where the people are sovereign, where the people are independent. The class that governs in the Republic of Ireland at the moment is effectively what we would call a comprador bourgeoisie. They are having difficulty actually managing an economy unless it's handed over to others. What we're looking at here is this fascination, a fixation, almost a fetish, about foreign direct investment. In other words, the ruling class in the Republic of Ireland at the moment cannot conceive of building an economy unless they bring in foreign investment and unless they hand it over to others. They haven't the confidence, they haven't the ability, and at the same time, it wouldn't even benefit them to have an economy managed on behalf of the working people. So therefore, we're looking at this absence of independence, absence of sovereignty, not only housing, we're looking at an iniquitous health service where actually the Republic of Ireland spends more of its GDP per annum on health than practically any other country in Western Europe. But at the same time, it has a two-tier health service for the simple reason so much of that budget is wasted on a private health service where there is extravagant expenditure, unnecessary expenditure. So let's take it then across the wider aspect of this. There is, as previous speaker mentioned, an inevitability about the ending of partition. The fact is that a recent opinion poll, and we have to be careful about opinion polls, headlines were indicating that only a minority of people in the north wanted a united Ireland, but what it didn't say was that in the under 40s, a majority would have wanted to see an end to partition. Now, so what we're talking here about is 10, 20, 25 to 30 years, which in the life of a people is actually quite short, as we know. Now, for all their problems, there is an awareness, even within a fairly ineffective Dublin government at the moment, there's a need to address global warming. There's a plan, or how maybe we suggest a defective plan or an inadequate plan, but it's a 25 to 30 year plan to deal with global warming, to address the issue. But take it that Northern Ireland, if it's not addressed, is at least as threatening to this island as global warming. And the Dublin government is shamefully, selfishly refusing to address that issue. The point about it is that it suits the regime in Dublin, and it suits the vested interests in the north to have partition, to keep, as Connolly talked about, dividing the working class so that we have a working class divided. Just think of what would happen if partition was removed, that a northern working class was demanding a national health service across the island, and that's something absolutely essential at the moment, is an All-Ireland health service. If a northern working class was demanding an All-Ireland housing executive, one of the few successes of the 6 counties over the last 50 years has been the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, which is now being run down actually in the interests of private investors. But if those demands were made, could you imagine the consternation, the challenge that would create for the Dublin establishment, the Southern Irish ruling class? So this is where we're talking about the need for sovereignty, the need for independence, because only through and with a sovereign Ireland, only with an independent Ireland. And I mean, independent, I'm not talking about the type of independence that we were told we gained in 1922. I'm talking about a pure, thoroughly going independent people, a sovereign people where we don't have to allow US troops to come into Shannon because we're afraid to insult or offend the United States, where we have to put, for example, 3,000 people to work in Intel, to build Intel at the risk of contracting COVID. The simple fact is, people would talk then about what would we do if we didn't have those 3,000 jobs. Well, the simple answer that I would put to them is that if we were to build the 40,000 houses per annum that we needed, we would certainly replace those jobs. But to do so, we need to have our own currency where we can pay those workers. That's where we need the sovereignty and independence to do that. That's what we're battling for. And of course, that's what the objective is. On the other hand, if we're to talk about negotiating the future of the island, we have to make, and it could be, it's a very difficult task to win over the unionist working class. Hence, having said that, we have to make an all-Ireland Republic attractive. If we just simply roll out what is there at the moment, it's going to be even more difficult to do so, with the potential of devastating violence. That we have a tragic history of violence in the north. The state was founded in bloodshed. Sporadic violence over the last century of that state. There's not, unfortunately, and I'm not, we have to be very careful about predicting calamity, but it would be very foolish, naive of us to think that we could have a transformation in the north without danger if we don't prepare for it, if we don't work for it. And that's something that's not happening at the moment. North or in the ruling, among the ruling class in the Republic. Micheál Martin is doing anything he can think of to stave off that possibility. Very selfishly, because I think what Micheál Martin is thinking is, that he will wait for his term of office to run out, and to hell with the consequences. After that, see his watch out and let it go at that. But the fact is that without Labour, the point is we'll not have sovereignty or independence, because it's not in the interests of the bourgeoisie to have independence or sovereignty. The bourgeoisie are depending on foreign investment, foreign finance. In fact, in many ways, it is the European Union, British imperialism, United States imperialism that is holding that ruling class in the south and north together, particularly in the south. Only the working class has an interest in reversing that, in changing that. So on that basis, we have to look at an alternative Ireland in which the working class take the lead, because only the working class will do so. But if the working class don't, the working class will again we will find ourselves in a position similar to what we have at the moment. We'll have housing crisis, we'll have a health crisis, we'll have an unemployment crisis, we'll have all the difficulties faced by Labour that David Gibney has outlined for us. Only when the working class have control, only then can we eradicate the problems that David talks about, and that can only be achieved really ultimately in a workers' republic. Let's be careful here that we're not overly pessimistic. We have to set the target, we've got to set the objective. The objective is a workers' republic and nothing short of it. It is achievable, it's possible, because at the end of the day, the working class is a majority in this society, in this island, and it's fundamentally in the interest of the working class to deliver a society in which the people that create the wealth will be in a position to distribute the wealth. I don't want to talk cliches, but I mean, that's where we have to look at. Otherwise, we end up in that position where we have neither independence or sovereignty. We end up with CETA, TTIP, Mercosur, those different trade agreements which are to the disadvantage of working people. And there is something that we have got to keep in mind, that this idea that if we didn't have foreign investment from multinationals, if we didn't have access to the European Union market, that this island of ours would sink below the waves, that we would go into bankruptcy. That's simply not the case. We can do very well. And something finally to keep in mind is that the world is now changing. The world is changing. We're in the declining days of the US empire. US imperialism is in decline. Mightn't seem to be the case, but it certainly is. The sun has set on the British Empire. It's setting on the US empire. There's new powers growing, China, Russia coming along. And at least the options are there. We don't have to tie our wagon any longer to British imperialism, US imperialism, European Union imperialism. Some may suggest that we'd be switching one for the other, but that's not necessarily the case. But we can thrive, we can do well if we have the economy under the control of working people, and that's what we're talking about. The North, yes, there is an inevitability about the North and partition ending, but if we don't address this issue of the working class, if Labour isn't in charge and driving the initiative, we will be back to where we started, only we'll have 32 counties instead of 26. We'll still have the same social and economic issues, problems and difficulties. And with the conditions changing so rapidly as a changeover, as partition ends, there's a glorious opportunity to enforce a workers' state, a workers' republic. Finally, let me just say that the idea that we could build socialism in the republic, what's now the republic, within the 26 counties on its own, just even on the simplest of facts, it's virtually impossible to do, because what would happen quite simply is that imperialism would find its interest served by creating an economic zone in the north, where, as happened in the last century with West Berlin, where Northern Ireland would find itself with zero rates of income tax, VAT, wages for professionals would increase to drain in a transitionary period, to drain the health workers, or the professional people, from health workers, technical workers, educational workers, not them all, but make it attractive to them to leave the Republic. It'll be a competition. Capitalism would create if you like, a small zone in the north. It can't be allowed to happen. So therefore, we have that overall interest in ensuring that partition is removed. Reunite the working class and make the demand for a workers' state. I think it's the idea that partition is ending within probably the next 20 to 30 years. It's an inevitability. So we have the opportunity to ensure that when it does, we'll build something better. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tommy. That was fantastic and really much appreciated. I'm going to go to Jane Crowe next. But before I do, I'll just put that Google form into the chat once again. If people are interested in staying in touch and possibly creating a campaign with eco-socialism at the heart for United Ireland, please do stay in touch. Jane, I'd love to welcome you to give a talk, to speak now. And again, I'd like to extend all of the solidarity of everyone here to yourself and to all the Debenhams workers who have been treated so brutally by the Guards over the last few days. Thanks, Jane.
Hi, everybody. I'm not as knowledgeable as the previous speakers, but and bear with me. I do tend to go off on a tangent with my stories, a little bit like Billy Connolly, but I do get back to where I'm going. I just have that much in my head to get out. But just in case anybody doesn't know, I'm one of the Debenhams workers that was made redundant 380 days ago. We received an email, just generic, telling us all our jobs were gone. Obviously, it was a shock to us all. We didn't know what to do, but we gathered ourselves, and within 2 weeks, we organised a protest outside the 2 flagship stores in Dublin and the other one in Cork. Things were against us from the very beginning because we had COVID. But we were prepared for that. We masked up, had gloves, kept socially distanced. But unfortunately in Dublin, the Gardaí didn't think that was enough and moved us on and went as far as seeing us onto our buses and transport home. That didn't stop us. We kept going, and 2 weeks after that, we done the same thing. They were a little bit more lenient. They gave us 20 minutes to speak to the press, but we kept going and we kept going. We hit banks, we hit the Dáil. Our struggle is been very hard on us, especially because we did have a collective agreement through our union from 2016 that covered that we would get our statutory 2 weeks redundancy plus 2 weeks on top of that per year's service, or a week per year service. And unfortunately, that wasn't honoured. So they said, oh, the company's gone, there's no money. But they were continuing to trade online, which was taken in 2 years before that, because we never got the last year's books. We never got to see them. So the last figures we had was online was taken in 40 million a year, and that was still up and running. So they could easily have paid us what we were due. So that became the main focus of our campaign, as well as protecting the stock in the stores, which we seen as part of our redundancy, that the sale of that could go and pay us their redundancy. So the pickets then started. We had a vote for a union, and it was a 96% yes vote, where we decided we would picket. So that was to stop the stock leaving the stores, which took everybody surprised, because people are saying, well, if you're not working and the store is already closed, how can you picket? Well, as I said, we proved them wrong. We're 380 days doing it. We've been very successful doing it. The liquidation should have been finished a long time ago, but we have prevented the stock leaving. That is up until recently, where KPMG, the liquidators, have got very, very heavy-handed with mostly female workers. It started 3 weeks ago up in Blanchardstown in Dublin, where they got a tip-off that the stock was going to be taken that night. So we went up, and the workers were there, supporters were there from Solidarity, People Before Profit, who we would be lost without over the last year. Absolutely fantastic support, especially Sive there, who's hosting. She's been amazing. Manuel, they've just been fantastic. And the trucks were there, they got loaded up, and the Gardaí were called because they seemed to be at the end of the phone to the liquidators. Anytime they ring, the Gardaí arrive, whereas everybody else in the country knows if you ring, there's not a sign of them. You could be waiting hours. So myself and the other shop steward spoke to the inspector at length. We held them off for 4.5 hours, and we decided to sit down on the road in front of the trucks. So they brought in 25 Gardaí for 13 people that were sitting on the road. We had supporters that didn't sit down. They were recording all the information for us. So they picked us up off the road completely, brought us down and corralled us in a corner, totally against all COVID regulations. We were all on top of each other. Thank God we all had our masks on. And the Gardaí allowed non-essential work to continue during level 5 lockdown, which seemed more important to them than anything else, to be able to do that. So we're rolling on a few weeks, and we got a tip off then in Henry Street, where I'll go back as well. The pickets went 24 hours because we knew that they could hit at night time as well, when there was no traffic around and no witnesses other than ourselves to see what was going on. So we got a tip off that they were in our store doing packing. And we went, and they opened up the shutter because we had it blocked. We had it that they couldn't open it, let's just say that. And the Gardaí came and said, we're just here to tell you that KPMG are going to open the shutter. And we said, are you going to move us on? And they said, no. But they stayed the entire hour to make sure that we didn't do anything to the hired security that the liquidator used. They're thugs, they're big, huge men there. They don't care, they push us. They did push us with the guards there, but they would have done a lot more if the guards weren't there. So again, the guards are becoming the hired security for the liquidators. Then we got a tip off the other night that our store was going to be hit. So we had 30 workers. We blockade ourselves in our loading bay. We put locks around the gates, and over a matter of hours, we had about 6. Well, I'm putting about 60 Gardaí. People are telling me I'm being very minimalist about that. They also came, the armed guards were there. And you have to remember that it's 90% women. We were mammies and grandmothers sitting down with our backs up against the gates, keeping the Gardaí out and keeping the trucks from coming in to take our redundancy money. So we're sitting there. They came in to read the court injunction, which the Gardaí are saying supersedes COVID restrictions. They're saying that this piece of paper, which was signed off in February, supersedes the lockdown of level 5. So it just goes to show you what way this state is being run down. You know, it's disgraceful. But we held them off. They eventually got in and decided to read all of us out the court injunction. So we sang so as he couldn't be heard. My little partner in crime there, Sive, she's one side of me, and one of the really good picketers was this side of me, and we were all linking and singing, and they decided to forcibly remove us. Now, you know, you have to bear in mind the majority of us are 50 years old and above. We had one woman who has retired since this all started last April. She was sitting there. So we were forcibly removed. Myself and Carmel beside me, we were the last two. They pleaded with us to go, and we said, we can't. We have to see this through. That's a redundancy in there. You're allowing them to conduct unnecessary work during COVID-5 restrictions. We find this is necessary. It's our constitutional right to be here. And yet you're walking over our constitutional rights and you're allowing non-essential work to proceed. They wouldn't have any of it. So we were there, we were hugging each other, trying not to be lifted. So we got more guards than anybody else did to lift them up. I was the last one carried out unceremoniously, I must say. And they were very, very heavy-handed. So much so that my zipped up coat came up over my head and onto the ground. And the top I was wearing came up over my head and off me. And my bra that I was wearing, they broke the straps on it. Once the left-hand side strap. So I was then put down on the ground in front of everybody, guards, spectators, supporters, co-workers, all recording. And I was put down on the ground, naked from the waist up. That wasn't nice. It was very degrading. Thank God everyone turned their cameras off when they realised what was happening, which I'm forever grateful for. And their answer to when people said, but look what you have done to her. We're standing around her to protect her. That's what they said. So we got up and even more Gardaí arrived then. So they blocked off the roads. The 2 trucks got a Garda escort up the wrong side of the road. Laws being broken everywhere. And yet we were being the ones that were made into criminals and being kept away. There were arrests made for people breaking COVID restrictions. Yet the KPMG security K-Tech were all on one ladder trying to open the shutter, which we had reblocked. Nothing said to them, but we had arrests for breaking COVID restrictions. So, you know, the way things are being allowed to happen down here is absolutely disgraceful. Now, this protest the other night, it went from, some of us arrived from 5 o'clock in the evening and we left at 4:30 the following morning. So, you know, people need to know what's happening. The legislation isn't there to protect workers. Solidarity People for Profit have put new legislation in because there is a Duffy Cahill report that's sitting there since Cleary's happened 5 years ago. And it's just been gathering dust until we found out about it last year and we brought it back to the front. And, you know, people are hopping on the bandwagon now trying to get the Duffy Cahill out there and done. There's still a year later. It's still not out there. And people that have jumped back on this bandwagon knew that was sitting there for the last 5 years until we highlighted it. So people have come back now and said, no, look what's happened to Debenhams. It needs to be redone, re-looked at. So Solidarity People for Profit have put their own legislation forward in the Dáil this week, which will protect workers, protect our collective bargains, and prioritise us above everybody else, all the creditors on the list when companies go into liquidation. People have to remember, you know, the government are looking at us as little people, you know, and it's the little people that keep the country going. They were all about shop workers saying, oh, you know, they're the frontline workers, we'd be lost without them. Well, look at all the little people, the frontline workers that are now out of work over the last year. They don't care. They're not looking after us. So with this legislation, this should look after us. And we're going to, you know, our legacy then hopefully will be that we got this legislation put through. Our stock is being taken out of our store. Not all of it. It will take 10, 15 trucks to take ours out. We're regrouping today to see what we're doing. Unfortunately, 4 trucks went into Tralee last night. And again, the workers down there were unceremoniously lifted up off the road, and this court injunction was prioritised over non-essential work during level 5 COVID. So we're all fighting. Even when the last piece of stock goes out the stores, we will fight for this legislation to change for all workers everywhere. Because at the very beginning of all this, we were told that we were unfortunate, that, you know, we were just ordinary people here working, trying to have a strike and have our voices heard in an extraordinary time. But in that time, us ordinary people of Debenhams turned into extraordinary people over the last year. And I'm very proud of every one of us that have stuck to the pickets and stuck out and ran in when red alerts went off, and all our supported Sarah have done it. And it's a year I will never forget. Besides COVID, I'm so proud of all of us that we would, I mean, I can't believe I'm doing this today. I never spoke in public, ever. I've been to many conferences with the union, and I've been asked to speak, you know, just even to put a motion forward from our branch. And I'm like, I'm not getting up there in front of 500 people. I just would never. But here I am, you know. I was on the news yesterday with the whole country looking. I just never thought this is anything I would do. But here we are, and I'm doing it. And I'm doing it for my son, for the future, that when he works, he could never do it, never happen to him again. So, yeah. So here's to all the extraordinary people of Debenhams.
Jane, thank you so much. We really, really appreciate your contribution and the struggle that you've been involved in for the last year. It's been really inspiring for anyone who's watching and anyone who's been involved. I can see clapping and everything.